Federal grand juries almost always hand prosecutors the indictments they seek. We spoke to attorney and founder of the Article 3 Project, Mike Davis, about what's going on with the D.C. grand jury pool.
I mean, it's extremely rare for grand jury proceedings to fail in normal jurisdictions, but we're dealing with the District of Columbia that voted 95% against President Trump, the District of Columbia that's full of criminals and bureaucrats and people who hate Trump. They have Trump derangement syndrome. And so they would rather let their city go to hell, our nation's capital go to hell, than be seen as supporting President Trump's law enforcement crackdown that's making D.C. safe for all Americans, particularly for Black D.C. residents in Southeast and Northeast, for examples, who are the victims of this crime.
U.S. District Attorney for D.C. Jeanine Pirro instructing prosecutors to seek the maximum penalties where allowed, to clean up the streets, and to deter future criminals. Critics calling these failed indictments the result of the justice system going too far, a silent protest by D.C. residents opposed to what some see as federal overreach. Davis noting the D.C. jury pool had no problem indicting more than 1,500 people in connection to January 6th. Even those who simply walked into the Capitol, took a look around, and then peacefully left were slapped with felony charges so overreaching the U.S. Supreme Court eventually intervened to rein them in.
The Biden Justice Department politicized, contorted a post-Enron obstruction of justice statute dealing with corporate fraud to go after their political enemies after January 6th. They persecuted Trump supporters. They threw them in jail with pretrial detention before their trials. They threw the book at these people. They ruined people's lives. They bankrupted them. People lost their families. They lost their freedom. They lost their jobs. They lost everything after January 6th. How the Biden Justice Department and these D.C. judges persecuted these people is unacceptable. And they gave amnesty to the much more deadly and destructive BLM and Antifa writers, right? And so it's very clear that our system in D.C. is so politicized. If you trespass into the Capitol and take selfies, you go to prison for a long time after January 6th. But if you assault a federal law enforcement officer, you don't even get charged.
In order for the feds to bring criminal charges, a grand jury must agree there is enough evidence to move forward. If prosecutors cannot secure an indictment, options are limited, though forcing a defendant to navigate the legal system can be some form of punishment, Davis says.
You have to indict criminals in the district where the crime occurred, unless the defendant waives that. That's part of our Constitution. And so it makes it very difficult when the grand jury is not indicting criminals. You can still bring misdemeanors against these people who are attacking officers. If the grand jury doesn't want to return felony indictments, then charge these criminals with misdemeanors and make them go through the process. And I always say that even if at the end of the day, these deranged juries are not going to find these criminals guilty, make these criminals still go through the process, make the process the punishment.
Team Trump is trying to make the nation's capital safe and secure. The D.C. mayor, wary of looking soft on crime, just issued an executive order that will pave the way for federal troops to remain there through at least December, leading to praise from the White House and to critics calling her misguided. On Tuesday, D.C.'s Attorney General Brian Schwab breaking with the mayor, suing the Trump administration in federal court, challenging the deployment of National Guard troops. Schwab releasing a statement, quote, "No American city should have the U.S. military, particularly out-of-state military, who are not accountable to the residents and untrained in local law enforcement, policing its streets. We've filed this action to put an end to this illegal federal overreach." Of course, the D.C. Police Union has already said they welcome the National Guard and their help. According to Davis, the D.C. Attorney General is unlikely to succeed.
The D.C. Attorney General is suing President Trump because President Trump is deploying the National Guard to help assist with crime in D.C. That is the president's absolute statutory and constitutional power and duty to protect our nation's capital. When the corrupt local Democrat politicians refuse to do their job and they allowed crime to overtake our nation's capital, of course the president, who is the head of the D.C. National Guard, can use the National Guard to assist law enforcement in putting down crime. I imagine that some local Democrat activist judge on the DC bench will rule against Trump, and it will have to get appealed, maybe all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court's going to side with President Trump on the use of the National Guard in DC. I have no doubt about that.
Mr. Trump posted on Truth Social this week that carjacking in D.C. is down 87% and that all other categories of crime are down, quote, massively. A poll from late August, 2 weeks ago, shows just 20% of D.C. residents favored the National Guard troops in D.C. One released yesterday, a national poll from The Economist/YouGov, showed nationwide it's a closer call. 49% of Americans oppose the troops in D.C., 42% support the effort.